officer. He graduated from Bowie State in Maryland. He has his MA and PhD from Kent State University, and he specializes in Civil War history, military history, and African history. So with that, Dr. Johnson.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you again in this weird format, but we're forging ahead anyway. For the second in our series, I apologize to you guys for last week. I went off script about the subject matter, just something that I thought would be pretty relevant to our times with regard to federal procurement. But today we're going to look at a last stand that I call the devastating demise of Eastern Airlines. Eastern Airlines was at one time one of the largest air carriers in the United States. Now, we all know that from the time of the Hindenburg, and I am not implying that anybody was alive to see the Hindenburg disaster, but the Hindenburg was a giant dirigible, or what they called an airship, that caught fire over Elmer in New Jersey. It was a great disaster that pretty much in the early part of the 20th century let people know just how risky air travel was. And then, of course, there are accidents that occur at air shows, and then airline accidents, which clearly catch people's attention. You know, it's just one of the things. I think that when people get on the airplane, we are so accustomed to flying, going to the airport. But with regard to Eastern Airlines, this article that I found, Eastern Airlines plans to fly again. In the August 26, 2019 issue of Forbes magazine, that article pointed out the following. Before its collapse and liquidation in the late 1990s, the late 1980s and early 1990s, Eastern Airlines was one of the nation's big four carriers. Now it could be taken to the skies again. The airline stopped flying after a 1989 labor dispute ultimately led to the carrier filing for bankruptcy. Now, that 1989 labor dispute is what we're going to be focusing on, because aside from being just another story of labor versus management, it's truly a fascinating story of labor versus management, but also how the world changed and people didn't change with it. Right now, the world is changing before our very eyes. The mere fact that you and I are communicating like this through this format is a signal, is a clear sign of how things will. It may not be like this permanently in the future, but this is going to be part of how we do things from this point forward. So likewise, what happened in 1989 showed that there are people who are already getting on with business, with the future, and then some people that were not catching up with it, and Eastern Airlines took a hit for that. Now, this goes on to say now the carrier is awaiting Department of Transportation approval for a rebirth that would see it providing service to the Caribbean, South America, and Asia. Like Circuit City. Think back to a time, remember Circuit City? They were across the nation, and they also went bankrupt. But like Circuit City and many other brand names that were once iconic, Eastern Airlines is today owned by a group that bought the intellectual property rights to the name. The airline has previously been focused on charter flights. It currently has 8 Boeing 767 aircraft to its name. Rather than taking on other airlines at their hubs, a strategy that contributed to its original downfall as it famously battled Delta Airlines for the Atlanta market, the new Eastern will focus on point-to-point flights. Now, that system of hubs, what they call the bicycle system, where you have, for example, like Delta has a hub in Atlanta, and I think maybe American or United has the hub in Chicago. Different cities are identified by different aircraft carriers or airline carriers as being major points where they just established their headquarters. They, of course, fly to other places. But this current system that we have came about as a result of some changes that took place in 1978. The article goes on to say that initially, the new Eastern Airlines plans to fly from New York's JFK to Guayaquil, Ecuador, Georgetown, Guyana, Anchorage, Alaska, and Jinyan, China, all smaller markets that are not served from JFK. As of now, there's no announced timeline for the carrier to resume flights. And I would go on to add that as of now, given the COVID-19 coronavirus, there may be an indefinite time period before the new Eastern Airlines can literally start taking off. Eastern has relaunched its website and rolled out a new logo to begin getting the word out and reminding people the carrier that was so big decades ago is still around today. Eastern Airlines was launched by seekers, explorers, and above all, flyers. Our passion, they say, for aviation is unmatched in the universe. We pay attention to every detail, from the tiniest mechanical check to the locally prepared meal served to the smiling customer in seat 17B. Although, given the kind of changes airlines are having to make today, again, because of the coronavirus, air travel may change, seat arrangements may change on aircraft, so who knows what 17B will be in the future. These were probably some of the most familiar statements that the old Eastern Airlines had in its advertisements. We have to earn our wings every day. Or I also recall one that said, we are the wings of man. This was a typical commercial, maybe not typical, but this was a commercial from 1985 when Eastern Airlines, it was in trouble at the time, but it still was a functioning airline. Take a look.
Every year, there comes a moment when that little voice inside you says,
Stanley, oh Stanley, it's time.
And when it's time to get away, Eastern Airlines can take you far away for far less than you might imagine to warm and sunny Florida, the Bahamas, and the Caribbean. So the next time your little voice tells you it's time to call Eastern.
Is it a time you listen to your little voice?
Orlando, 284 to 438, airfare, hotel, and car.
It's time.
From that commercial, you might even get the impression that in 1985, Eastern was a strong airline, but beneath the surface, behind all that opulence, all that luxury, all that sultry music in the commercial, Eastern Airlines in 1985 was in some serious, significant trouble. So we have to ask the question, what happened? What happened so that one of the big four, one of the top four airlines in the United States that covered coast to coast and was a multi-million-dollar enterprise, what happened that just eventually literally had it crash into the ground? Let's start here. This guy in the picture, his name is Alfred E. Kahn, a Cornell University economist. Alfred Kahn was among the first to view the airline industry strictly as a business. Now, given that we've flown on planes so much in the last 20, 30, 40 years, it may be very difficult to remember a time when the airline industry wasn't a business. But we have to also take into consideration, there was a time when the airlines were not deregulated. They were very highly regulated, and they became part of the first wave of a number of deregulations in industry that led to what was supposed to have been greater competition. That was good for the customer, good for the economy, and in many ways that proved out. But the phrase unintended consequences also was very relevant. So as you see here, Cornell University economist Alfred E. Kahn was among the first to view the airline industry strictly as a business. And when I say strictly as a business, I mean strictly as a business. All the things that any normal business would have driving it, considerations for cost effectiveness, overhead, all that. Airlines were somehow free of that or didn't have to consider it in the same kind of way. But Alfred E. Kahn changed all that. He believed that breaking up the industry structure would create new airlines, increase competition, and lower fares. Now, he was eventually appointed chairman of something called the Civil Aeronautics Board to lead the nation into airline deregulation. In 1978, the Congress passed something called the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. It was passed with bipartisan support. Therefore, Republicans and Democrats both signed on to it. Many people in the industry thought it was a wolf in sheep's clothing, hence the picture. But part of the legislation called for the phasing out of the Civil Aeronautics Board. It immediately lifted restrictions on fares and access to air routes. So here's the point. The Airline Deregulation Act basically lifted restrictions on fares and access to routes, which means that before then, there were restrictions on fares and access to routes. Different airlines where it could be guaranteed that they fly from this point to that point and no one else could intrude in that market. What the Airline Deregulation Act did was that it opened up the skies to anybody. So it became kind of like the Wild West of air travel. Established airlines rushed to gain or preserve access to their most lucrative routes. New airlines quickly formed. Now, I'm not so sure, but I think Southwest Airlines started right around 1971, and they had only like maybe three or four aircraft in 1971. So this was a piece of good information, good news for Southwest, a fledgling airline that eventually it would grow to be a $1 billion enterprise and one of the top airlines in the world. Now, just as was intended, the fierce competition from the new airlines did cause a price war that drove fares down, and people began flying in record numbers. As you can probably imagine, the airlines went from this situation where they had guaranteed routes, guaranteed fares, a guaranteed situation, essentially guaranteed profitability if they could be profitable. They definitely did not like this new style of competition, this new phase where they had to really actually work for the money they were going to be making. So they opposed the deregulation, but it passed anyway. So what the airlines did was they encouraged their employees to lobby against it, and there were fears of destabilization, and those fears, even for all the benefits that may have come from deregulation, the instability that was predicted, it also came as well. And in some cases, it proved to show that those who were weak got out of the business, and those who were strong stayed in the business, but it also made life a little bit difficult for passengers as well. On October 24, 1978, President Jimmy Carter signed the Airline Deregulation Act into law, and it was the first time in US history that an industry had been deregulated. Now, this is 1978, so stand by, because 1978, then 1979, then the 1980s. Remember the 1980s? Interesting decade, a lot of different things happening. Some of the key are some of the high points of the 1980s. Among other things, there are many things that happened, but Rubik's Cube was released in 1980. The royal wedding of Diana and Prince Charles in 1981. The first artificial heart in 1982. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday was finally established as a holiday in 1983. The 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. The recovery of the Titanic wreckage in 1985. The Challenger disaster in 1986. The Wall Street crash. I think they called it Black Thursday in 1987. And then World's AIDS Day in 1988. Very turbulent decade, the 1980s. And also in 1980, of course, we had the election of Ronald Wilson Reagan, the 40th president of the United States. You couldn't have found a more appropriate figure to be elected president at a time when the process of deregulation was just beginning. And with the Deregulation Act, the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, that was a precedent that was set and tailor-made for a guy like Reagan, who came in with an eye to take the restrictions of government off of industry and allow more investment, more competition, or to create more investment, more competition in other industries as well. And it just so happened that soon after Reagan was inaugurated, that a part of the airline industry or part of the airline apparatus inside the United States gave him the opportunity to show who he was and just how new the situation was for the airlines in general. And it had to do with the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or what they call PATCO. PATCO people, the members of PATCO worked for the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. So they basically were private individuals, but also worked for a federal agency. They decided to go on strike. That set up a clash between them and the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan decided he brought a sledgehammer to the situation. So these guys went on strike. They wanted better pay, they wanted better hours, better benefits for retirement. As you can see here, and at the time, I recall, this was a very serious problem because after all, airplanes landing and taking off, they need air traffic controllers. You cannot have airplanes, especially the number of airplanes that we have in the sky, not having any kind of guidance systems or people telling them when to land, what's clear, runways to land on, emergencies and so forth. Pilots have enough to do just flying the plane that they're in. So this was a very serious situation across the United States. And Reagan, it was one of his first big challenges when he was in office, and he stepped up to it like the man he was. So let's review. In 1968, PATCO was formed or created. In February 1981, the new contract negotiations started between PATCO and the FAA. The members wanted a reduced 32-hour work week, a $10,000 pay increase. What a novel idea, right? Less time at work, more money for work, a better benefits package for their retirement, and the contract negotiations stalled. Needless to say, the FAA was not agreeing with all this, and of course the PATCO members were driving for the best bargain they could get. On August 3rd, so February, March, April, May, June, July, August, 6 months later, 13,000 members go on strike. Now, they were technically violating a 1955 law that banned strikes by government unions. Basically, you can't bring the federal government to a standstill, or you can't bring a part of the federal government to a standstill. And President Reagan said that the PATCO strike constituted a peril to national security. He ordered them to go back to work. And he warned that anyone who didn't return to work within 48 hours was going to be fired. And then a federal judge added on by saying that the union had to pay a $1,000 fine every day that they were out on strike. There were 7,000 flights that were canceled. So clearly this thing had reached a critical point. The people in PATCO did not believe President Reagan. In other words, they poked the bear once too often. On August 5th, 1981, most of the striking PATCO members were fired. This sent a thunderclap, not only through the airline industry, but throughout industry in general. I mean, you're talking about a union, and at that point, the union movement in the United States, it was weakening, but was nowhere near as weak as it is today. So this thing, the firing of union members, the firing of members of any union was a significant eye-opening event. And the fact that it came directly from the president showed exactly where Reagan was on this kind of an issue. He banned them from ever being rehired again by the FAA. So not only are you fired and you are not allowed even to reapply for your job. In other words, the agency that you work for is prohibited, is forbidden to rehire you again. And they replaced most of those air traffic controllers with supervisors, in other words, management and military controllers. A few days later, about 12 days later, on August 17th, the FAA began accepting applications for new air traffic controllers. By October, the FLRB, the Federal Relations Board, decertified PATCO, and the new air traffic controllers formed a new union or new organization called the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. Now, they were eventually certified in 1987 as a sole bargaining unit for FAA air traffic controllers, and in 1993, President Clinton reversed the prohibition on rehiring the air traffic controllers who had been part of PATCO. But I mean, look at that. It's like 12 years later. Most of those people more than likely have moved on. And then in 1996, Congress passed something called the Federal Aviation Reauthorization Act, which codified the new union's ability to bargain with the FAA for wage and personnel matters. So that took care of the crisis of the air traffic controllers. But what that did, when President Reagan fired those guys, now think about this. Let's add all this together. In the first instance, you have the federal government, which has passed a legislation that's deregulating airlines. That's the first thing. So now more and more airlines begin to come into existence. They proliferate. Price wars, fare wars, bigger routes, competition, prices go down, a little more chaos, more passengers at the airport, which increases congestion and longer lines, security, all the things that we live with when we're flying on a regular basis. But then the air traffic controllers go on strike. The strike is busted, which means that the union is busted. That introduces something else. So in a deregulated environment, now the unions have lost some power. What's going to happen next? Essentially, they were fired in the most complete way imaginable, which brings us to the saga of Eastern Airlines, because while all that was going on with the air traffic controllers and the deregulation, Eastern Airlines was entering into a period of some significant trouble. Now, by the time you get to 1981, the airline Eastern was being run by Frank Borman, the former astronaut. By 1986, let's look at some of the problems that Eastern had accrued. By then, it was the third largest carrier and also in decline. Its route structure was inherently weak. In other words, the old routes that Eastern had from flying from here to here to here that had been guaranteed under the old regime with the Airline Deregulation Act, those routes suddenly became weaker as competition increased and service increased as well. Eastern's costs were sky high, and they had an issue with unions fighting with not just management, but fighting with each other. And management meant they were also fighting with Frank Borman. Now, let's take a moment and do some background on Frank Borman. Frank Borman, of course, was a member of the National Aeronautics Space Administration. He was part of the Apollo program. The Apollo program, as you'll recall, was that program that was designated. You had the Mercury program, which was designed to see if America could get a man or woman into space. We did that. Then the Gemini program, which was dedicated to see, could you get someone into space, have to go around the Earth, and then do what they call EVA, extravehicular activity. We did that part. And then docking maneuvers, seeing if they could get spacecraft to dock and maneuver and learn how to fly in space. The Apollo program, the ultimate objective of that program was to take all that information, all that learning, all that technology from Mercury and Gemini and build it into Apollo and take it straight to the moon. The objective, land the man on the moon. Now, Frank Borman was not part of the mission of Apollo that landed on the moon, but he did get to the moon. The whole objective was to put people on the moon, to land the man on the moon, and take off from the moon in fulfillment of the vision established by or articulated by President John F. Kennedy in the early 1960s when he said that America would put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. It was 1968. Frank Borman had been a high school football star. He had quarterbacked his team to the Arizona State Championship. He had been an Air Force test pilot and got into the space program very early on. He was part of that Apollo crew that circled the moon in Apollo 8 in 1968. And when he left the space program and went into the private sector, he was considered to be basically a hero in a business suit who for a time breathed life into an airline awash in red ink. So even when Frank Borman took over or came in as CEO of Eastern Airlines, they were already having some financial problems and were deep in the red, but he was able to turn it around for a moment. On December 24th, 1968, as I think about it and think about all the things, 1968 did not have a global pandemic to deal with, but 1968 was a busy, stressful, and many people thought just terrible year. In January 1968, The year started off with the USS Pueblo, an American spy ship, being seized by North Korea. And in January 1968, the North Vietnamese launched their Tet Offensive in Vietnam. We need to remember that while all this is going on, Vietnam was still very much a real war, taking real American lives and costing lots of millions of dollars of American finance. So the Tet Offensive started, and of course the Tet Offensive will be that event that proves that we are not just having difficulty in Vietnam, but we're not winning in Vietnam. So people began asking, so what are we doing over there? Why are we sending our young people to fight in the war that clearly we've been there all this time, but we're not winning? And people began having serious doubts about Vietnam. In March 1968, President Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not run for the presidency. In April 1968, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. In August 1968, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the president who had been slain in 1963, he was assassinated in Los Angeles while campaigning for the presidency. Not to mention that in December of 1968, the Democratic Convention in Chicago was just a melee. It was the worst example of public civil disobedience. It was the Chicago police unleashed, people getting beaten in the streets, all kinds of it was just anarchy, it looked like. And for people sitting at home watching on their TV screens, they were wondering, what in the world is the country coming to? And as we've been in the middle of this pandemic, I've often been saying to myself, remembering things like 1968, when people were thinking, was the world coming to an end? It sure looked like it, but you know what? We got through it. And it's a good reminder for us right now. We'll get through this thing. But then came December 1968. People were tired. They were exhausted. I think, quite frankly, people just wanted 1968 to end, so 1969 and whatever it would bring, it at least wouldn't be 1968. But then on December 24th, 1968, something pretty amazing happened. Frank Borman and the crew of the Apollo 8, circling the moon, sent this broadcast back to people on Earth. So from the heavens or space, in what was it then, a very horrible year. Many people said it was the worst year, it's some of the worst social division since the Civil War. I need to emphasize that. America had not seen that kind of civil division, that kind of strife, that kind of tribalization in the country since the Civil War. You know, that thing where people fought from 1861 to 1865 that took nearly 1 million lives. That's what 1968 was. And in the midst of all that, at the very end, Frank Borman and the crew of the Apollo 8 sent this message of hope.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament, the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God
you could not have found a more appropriate message to bring hope to humanity and specifically Americans in 1968 and to close out what was a very turbulent, troubling year of 1968. Frank Borman was part of that. In January 3rd, 1969, he and their crew, Bill Anders, Jim Lovell, and Frank Borman all made the cover of Time magazine as not Man of the Year, but Men of the Year. But as I mentioned, we need to keep in mind that in 1968, when they made that transmission, Vietnam was still very much a real war. It was going to go on for a few more years. We fast forward to what happens when Frank Borman gets to Eastern Airlines. Frank Borman was a kind of hands-on CEO. If you recall, maybe you don't recall, I don't know, but he definitely put himself out there to get involved in the commercials. And just watching the commercials, you get the idea that Frank Borman is a hands-on manager. I don't mean hands-on as in micromanaging people and telling them what T to cross and what I to dot, but he's just a very, very attentive kind of manager, a very attentive kind of boss who took interest in not only the financials of the company, but the people who are working at the company. Somebody who seemed to really care about obviously the customers, but also the people who are serving the customers. And as you can see from this advertisement, there's nothing special about a pillow unless it's not there. So he's constantly talking about how Eastern, you don't have to fly Eastern Airlines, but they got to do the little things better so that you can choose them. There was this recognition that people had other choices in airlines, and they did. This one, if you don't like the way we treat you on the phone, we know what you'll do. Go someplace else. And this one, all airlines fly at the same speed, but bad service can make a flight seem longer. He's right. Here's one from 1976.
Baggage claim is an airline's last chance to disappoint a customer. There's no better way to ruin a perfect flight than to make you wait for your bags right here. I'm Frank Borman, the president of Eastern Airlines. At Eastern, we believe that baggage claim is also a pretty good place to keep a customer happy. And the best way is to try to have his suitcase get here before he does. It means we really have to hustle. And since we handle over 40 million bags a year, we're bound to goof once in a while. But we're doing our best to cut down on delays, damage, and loss. We know what it means to you to be able to get off the airplane, get your suitcase, and go. Look, there are a lot of airlines out there you can fly besides Eastern. So if we want you to fly Eastern all the time, and we do, we have to earn our wings every day.
If you've ever lost a bag during air travel, you know how important that really is. It is so annoying to have to go to the office where they track down the bags and you have your stuff in there and you wait for them to find it and they bring it even a few hours later. It just messes up the trip. So this was a very slick piece of advertising. Then there was this one.
If you like people, you'll love New York. Eastern takes care of about 5 million travelers a year here. For many of them, their first contact with us is BT Tynes. We've just added a $500,000 baggage system to help him out, but it can never do the job he does. The A300 is our biggest new investment. It's quiet, fuel efficient, spacious. But if our crew doesn't make you feel comfortable, it won't matter what plane you're flying. I fly Eastern, but you don't have to. So we have to earn our wings every day.
You can hear the tagline, we have to earn our wings every day, the wings of man. And again, it's interesting to me that in these advertisements, he's not talking about what happens in the air, the aircraft. He's talking about the service, finding your bag, stuff that happens on the ground. So air traffic and the passengers on the ground where they are, he's looking at the small little details. Eastern was that kind of an airline. So from 1975 roughly to 1986, Frank Borman piloted Eastern Airlines. July 1st, 1986 was his last day though, as chairman and chief executive. He eventually went on to assume the title of vice chairman of the board of Texas Air Corporation. Now, this is where the story takes a very interesting turn. Texas Air Corporation was the holding company that agreed to take over Miami-based Eastern for $674 million. I'm telling you, I wish earlier in my career in a previous life that I had really known what a holding company was about, because a holding company, as far as I understand it, a holding company is exactly that, a company that holds on to a piece of property or an asset. And usually what they do, they hold on to it to see how they can make it more profitable. And usually they make it more profitable by selling off the pieces of it. I went through this personally myself when the company I worked for, Goodyear Aerospace, the parent company was Goodyear Tire and Rubber in Akron, Ohio. At the time, Goodyear Tire and Rubber was the largest rubber or tire manufacturer in the entire world. We were a division. We were rated in the same time period, right around 1986, 1987. We were ahead as a holding company, as part of a holding company, and they began selling out the pieces. We were one of the pieces that got sold off. And from the moment we were sold, there were layoffs for the next 13 years. Maybe some of you have had different experiences, but my recollection of what happens when a holding company gets a hold of you is you should stand by, because rarely do good things happen. Now, as indicated here, it was agreed that the holding company would take over Miami-based Eastern for $674 million. And it was a buyout that had to wait for federal approval. Now, approval meant that if it was approved, if the buyout of $674 million was approved, that meant that Eastern would be rescued from bankruptcy, or bankruptcy that had been pending since 1974. The person who was the chairman of Texas Air was a guy named Francisco or Frank Lorenzo, who in the midst of Eastern's troubles, he made a surprise bid for them. Now, Frank Lorenzo, I suppose the people at Eastern, they were mad at Frank Borman because of some things that have been going on. But you know the saying, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't? They were a lot better with the devil they knew, as in Frank Borman. Frank Lorenzo, born May 19, 1940. The guy had already made a reputation for himself. People said he was a piece of work. I mean, he had many names. They called him a piece of work. They called him a jerk. Frank Lorenzo was called greedy. He was called a vulture. He was called a greedy vulture. And generally speaking, well, he was also called Satan, a devil, and compared to the devil. And generally speaking, this is where I'm going to let you all figure it out for yourselves. And generally speaking, he was also called I trust you got it. Background. Frank Lorenzo was the son of immigrants from Spain. He worked his way through Columbia College, selling ties at Macy's, waiting tables, and working at school. So the guy had a serious work ethic and a lot of drive, a lot of energy. In other words, he was not afraid to get out and work for what he wanted. In 1963, he graduated from Harvard Business School and launched his career in airlines with TWA, Trans World Airlines. In 1972, 9 years later, he took the success from that venture, or that part of his career, and established a consulting business and purchased an ailing or a not well-performing regional carrier called Texas International Airlines. And from there, he proceeded to build a company called Texas Air Corporation. And now watch this, look at this. Frank Lorenzo established Texas Air Corporation and absorbed people. Remember the airline called People Express? Frontier Airline, and New York Air, his Texas Air Corporation absorbed 3 other airlines. And in 1982, he also took over Continental Airlines. Now, Continental Airlines, their hub was Cleveland, Ohio. This guy was so ruthless, or I guess the battle for Continental was so hostile that the president of Continental Airlines committed suicide upon Frank Lorenzo taking over the airline. Who does that? People knew him as a ruthless risk taker. Colleagues in the industry, they respected him, but they absolutely distrusted him. Now, what Frank Lorenzo would do, he would take over an airline and start slashing amenities. He would reduce the workforce, cut down on the service. In other words, he would trim wherever he could to make the airline run as lean and efficiently as possible. And if an airline was running lean and efficiently, that allowed him to lower the cost for airline tickets. And what it did was it set off a price war with other airlines. Now, for the consumer, low ticket prices are a good thing. So if you're ever wondering how you ended up going from lobster meals on an aircraft, on your aircraft flight, to getting peanuts and a cup of water, this is part of the process. And what eventually happened was that the fare wars set Frank Lorenzo at odds with American and United Airlines, and that battle continued for years. Now, from this perspective of Frank Borman, the chairman and CEO of Eastern Airlines, Frank Lorenzo eventually took over Eastern Airlines in that bid I was telling you all about, where he bought it for $674 million. And so Frank Borman had to work with him, and Frank Borman said, "I've grown to admire Lorenzo, and I think we'll work well together." But it wasn't to be a long-term relationship. Frank Borman eventually moved on to an unclear role at Texas Air, and it wasn't full-time. And because Texas Air was located in Houston, Texas, in Houston, Frank Borman was not going to be a daily sort of individual presence at Texas Air, because he and his wife were planning to move to Las Cruces, New Mexico, where his son Fred owned a car dealership. So Frank Borman said, basically, as he was exiting Eastern Airline, that his plans were to write memoirs. He would certainly be looking for positions in government he could be appointed to, and he would get involved in other business opportunities. So basically, Eastern Airlines was losing a pretty good CEO. As he left, there were reflections, realizations, and regrets. Frank Borman, for example, said, "I think the American labor movement doesn't understand they're part of the competitive picture. They remind me of people who keep denying reality." By the time Frank Borman left, Eastern Airlines had lost $415 million in 6 years. And he blamed those losses on union contracts that kept costs far above those of newer carriers and the deregulated market marketplace. One of these days, I'm going to have to do a presentation for you all on what the situation was like at General Motors, at least a part of General Motors where I worked back during the same period. Because what Frank Borman was talking about, the costs that were imposed or that were added on because of labor. And believe me, I'm not an enemy of labor, but when you see how some of these labor contracts were structured, it just leaves you scratching your heads that management ever agreed to some of this stuff. His biggest regret was that the company didn't have the resources, the money, to resist a strike by the machinists during a 1983 contract dispute and had to yield to the union's demands. He said, "I couldn't convince the labor leaders that the numbers had changed." So Frank Borman is talking to these guys. Listen, we can't do this financially. And of course, people in labor, they don't believe you. They like, you guys are executives. You men and women, you go here, you do this, and they have all these perks and so forth. We want a piece of the action. Frank Borman was trying to explain to them, the world has changed. It's a different environment. It's a different industry. Now, the chief antagonist, if you want to call him that, for Frank Borman and eventually Frank Lorenzo was a guy named Charles Bryan. He was head of District 100 of the International Association of Machinists. And when Frank Borman left, Charles Bryan said, at this point, I don't see any relevance to whether he, that is Borman, is here or not any longer. Frank Borman and Charlie Bryan, they did not start out being enemies, but by the time Frank Borman left, he wanted Charlie Bryan's scalp. Some background on Charlie Bryan. Charlie Bryan grew up in West Virginia. This guy was he's definitely your old school labor leader. He was hard-nosed and would stand his ground. The people in his union loved him because he fought for them and he wouldn't take no for an answer. In 1956, he joined Eastern as a mechanic until going full-time to the International Association of Machinists in 1972. So for 16 years, he was a mechanic, and then he became part of the labor union's management structure in 1972. The big issue in the 1980s, I don't know about you all, this took me by surprise. The big issue for the airline industry in the 1980s was involved pushing back from the gates. You know how you get on an aircraft, you go down the jetway, you get in the aircraft, get in your seats, and then they do the pushback. This was the big deal for these guys in the 1980s. At many carriers, international IAM members, they were the ones that did the pushbacks. At Eastern, those workers were mechanics. So the people that actually pushed the aircraft back from the jetway, they would get in these little tractors and literally shove the aircraft back. Eastern wanted the airplanes to push back under their own power instead of having the people from the International Association of Machinists driving these tractors, pushing them back. The IAM members said, look, we're not having it. We're not doing it that way. So Charlie Bryan told the people at Eastern, you're not going to do this. And amazingly, to give you an idea of what kind of man Charlie Bryan was, the first time they tried to do it, he went onto the tarmac at Atlanta and stood in the back of an aircraft that was literally being pushed back from the jetway. He stood there, they knew he was behind them, they pushed back anyway and blew him halfway down the tarmac. Now, eventually, the pushback issue became a problem, or at least a point of contention for all the carriers, and eventually it just went by the wayside as a thing that people were having confrontations about. In 1983, Charlie Bryan helped set up something called an employee ownership plan at Eastern. Now, people in the industry were watching this with a great deal of interest because the idea of employees owning a company or employees owning part of a company was a pretty, not brand new idea, but still kind of innovative. And workers in 1983 also agreed to make major concessions. So they agreed in setting up the program where they would set up the employee ownership. Part of that included them agreeing to have wage cuts worth more than $800 million in return for an equity stake of about 20% in the company and 2 seats on the board. So the employees demanded to have 2 seats on the board, 20% stake in the company, and they would give up $800 million in wages. Charlie Bryan was one of the 2 union leaders to be part of that corporate board. Now, Delta, US Airways, and United eventually added union members to their boards. Charlie Bryan was troubled even after this agreement, and he's on the board, and they made the wage concessions. Charlie Bryan was upset that Eastern's management continued to seek further concessions in wages and benefits, and that Frank Borman eventually sold the company to Frank Lorenzo despite the labor opposition. So in 1983, they decided to strike. This was the strike that 3 years later led Frank Borman to decide he was going to leave. But honestly, it hadn't always been that way between Frank Borman and his employees. A Los Angeles Times article put it like this: Frank Borman was a hero in a business suit who for a time breathed life into an airline awash in red ink. To Eastern's employees, he was something of a father figure. They called him Colonel. and they rubbed shoulders with him as he walked around the Miami terminal, sometimes working alongside skycaps at curbside. He preceded all the excellence books, said one contemporary. He practiced hands-on management. He was very visible, popular with employees, but his popularity had faded in recent years as Borman time and again asked employees to accept wage cuts until they, the employees, came to believe that their beloved colonel had become an ogre with his hand in their pockets. We're talking about the 1980s. It's only about maybe 7 or 8 years after the airlines have been deregulated. The dust is still settling. The smoke is still clearing. There's a lot more airlines. The old ways of doing business, where the unions are very rigid in their structure and demanding things, that was for pre-1978. It's a brand new world. And a guy like Frank Lorenzo, he was tailor-made to get in there and move things around and be very aggressive the way he was. And Eastern management and Eastern unions just were not positioned to move fast enough for that new environment. So, as he departed, Frank Borman had a few words for the people, and especially Charlie Bryan, that he was leaving behind.
Hello, I'm Frank Borman, and I'm recording this on Sunday evening. It's a little bit past 8:30 now, almost 26 hours since Continental ceased operation. After setting things on course this morning with a series of meetings, I've tried to reflect on the past 5 years and to look back at some of the communications that I've had with you, because we are really approaching a fundamental decision as a family here at Eastern. And without saying I told you so, you know, and I'm quite convinced that many of you think I've been predicting too many dire circumstances and issuing too many warnings. But let me just go back and tell you, we predicted what was going to happen with deregulation, and we're living it now. We predicted what was going to happen with the proliferation and the growth of low-cost carriers, and we're living it now. Some of you more recently remember that I predicted that if indeed we tried to fly through a machinist strike, we would only last about 2 weeks. I know that cost me a lot of credibility, and yet look here at Continental, who had a better financial situation going in. They lasted a little over 4 weeks, and now they're in Chapter 11. So I guess that it's a fact of life that people don't like change. People don't like change, particularly if it's perceived as threatening. And here we are in the midst of a dynamic industry that is really offering nothing but threatening change.
Frank Borman very nicely summed up the situation. And did you notice? He just could not resist the urge to tell them, I told you so. But he had, and he was correct. So with Frank Borman gone, now it came down to a contest between Frank Lorenzo and Charlie Bryan. Two strong-willed men, two people who were not accustomed to hearing the word no, two people who were determined to do what was best for their own individual interests. And in Charlie Bryan's case, for him and the members of his union, for Frank Lorenzo, for himself, and whatever shareholders or other financial interests were part of his organization. So this thing turned into a brawl. I mean, it turned into a nasty, nasty fight that got so big and so large, it caught the attention of the American people and eventually people in Congress. Frank Lorenzo came under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of criticism for what was perceived as unnecessarily antagonizing people in labor. Of course, the people in the labor movement hated him, but Frank Lorenzo was one of these rare individuals who just shook it off, stuck to his guns, and kept on moving. His Texas Air Group bought Eastern in 1986. Lorenzo and Charlie Bryan clashed when Lorenzo brought Eastern into bankruptcy court and demanded more wage and benefit cuts from the International Association of Machinists members. Now, keep in mind that by 1986, the IAM members had already given wage and benefit concessions during the time of Frank Borman. But now they're in bankruptcy court, and Frank Lorenzo basically got a gun to their head saying, look, either give me more cuts or else. Charlie Bryan and the IAM members had one response. They said, no, we backed up enough. We're not giving up anything else. So in 1989, the employees at Eastern Airlines, and because Frank Lorenzo by that point also owned Continental Airlines, Eastern went on strike, and Continental did not violate or did not cross picket lines. They, in support of Eastern, went on strike also against Frank Lorenzo. This included the flight attendants, the machinists, and the pilots. If you see here, bear with me as I read. On March 4th, 1989, 8,500 machinists, supported by 5,900 flight attendants and 3,400 pilots, walked off the job at Eastern Airlines. Above, as you can see here, in a picket line in front of Eastern Air Shuttle at New York's LaGuardia Airport on the third day of the strike. So March 4th, this picture's taken on March 7th. Here, striking union members were barred from picketing inside airports, so machinists and supporters staged walkthroughs, crowds of supporters marching through airport terminals wearing buttons, hats, and t-shirts. Red strike t-shirts became a well-known symbol of the strike. So here, above, LaGuardia Airport walkthrough, March 31st, 1990. The strikers and their supporters focused in on their main enemy, Frank Lorenzo, Eastern's chief executive and the most prominent union buster in the United States. Take note of the fact that by this time, Frank Lorenzo had a reputation that had earned him the nickname or the name of being a union buster. Now, it's during the same period where General Motors, the automotive industry, is starting to go into a serious tailspin itself, because the labor movement among the UAW, and this of course impacts Michigan directly, began to have some problems of its own, and they really have not really ever recovered from that. I don't know about you all, but you know, I never really just imagined pilots also being part of a picket line. You know, the pilots are the ones that very nice, calming, you know, deep voice that comes over the intercom. They're very elegant and so forth. So the idea of seeing them, you know, walking the picket line, but such was the solidarity between the pilots, the machinists, and the flight attendants that they all were out there. So if anything else, it just showed how unified they were in their opposition to Frank Lorenzo. And the hatred of Frank Lorenzo got to the point where some of them were saying, we are willing to lose our jobs.
Run those big things.
We're willing to lose our jobs,
They don't
even
understand
if
this. They have to know every system.
No,
And if it doesn't work, what do we do?
yeah.
we're willing to lose our jobs, even if it means getting rid of Frank Lorenzo. You see this guy, the guy in the foreground, he's wearing the red t-shirt that we talked about just a moment ago. So there you have Lorenzo on the left, Charlie Bryan on the right. Lorenzo made a very good adversary. He managed to get many of his employees and much of America to dislike him. He appeared to be trying to kill Eastern, partially because he moved Eastern's assets to Continental, setting it up to become the leading US airline after he left. And that's exactly what Frank Lorenzo was doing. That's why I said what I said earlier about a holding company. Texas Air Group was a holding company. So Lorenzo really was interested, it turns out, in building Continental Airlines. Eastern was in financial trouble. So what he was doing was taking the best parts of Eastern, selling it off, or transferring it to Continental Airlines. So Eastern Airline employees, of course, were right to be concerned that he's basically picking their bones clean. this is a pretty good summation of the entire dismal affair of the last stand between Frank Lorenzo and the airline pilots, machinists, and flight attendants of Eastern Airlines.
Have you jumped on the brand wagon? Tomorrow, some facts about oat bran and cholesterol.
Also, Mary Beth Hurt and Randy Quaid, Danny Glover.
Including his gold Eastern annual pass, which I understand he doesn't have anymore.
By the end of 1988, Frank Lorenzo still controlled Eastern Airlines, but his freedom to maneuver was limited. The National Mediation Board refused to release Eastern and its unions from mediated wage negotiations. Legally, this meant Lorenzo couldn't cut wages or hire non-union workers. Without a release, Lorenzo felt that he had no choice but to step up the sale of Eastern's assets.
When a patient has cancer and you apply chemotherapy, you don't like the look of some of the symptoms. And unfortunately, while I'm not thrilled with that analogy, the fact is there's a lot there to be learned from.
Lorenzo can't solve Eastern Airlines' problems. I don't think he could from the beginning, and I don't think he can now. The airline business is essentially a service business. In the end, everybody can buy the same airplanes. The real difference, airline to airline, is the people. It's how they deal with their management, with each other, and most importantly, in the end, with the flying public. You can't run a service business with the management and the workforce in a state of perpetual warfare.
On October 13, 1988, Texas Air made a deal to sell the Eastern Shuttle to real estate magnate Donald Trump.
The sale today is not our preferred course. However, we have been deprived of an environment to negotiate the contracts at Eastern, specifically with the IAM.
The valuable shuttle accounted for half of the company's operating profits. Its sale demoralized the union. It demonstrated that Lorenzo would keep selling pieces of the airline unless the unions gave in.
Selling off good parts of Eastern to hold on to the bad parts of Eastern is exactly what people do when they're in trouble. People who are in trouble always end up selling off the good part of the business and holding the bad. So looking at least that part of the Texas Air empire, one would say that it doesn't augur well for the future.
If the fuel markets turn and we have an economic slowdown and Texas Air doesn't make it, we're going to have a fiasco in this country because 20% of the capacity in this country has been allowed to come under the control of a highly leveraged company, which is embarked in a confrontation between labor and interest cost. It's not labor and management, it's labor and interest cost.
When the dust settles, when the sun sets, there is one big question with which we are left. What, after all, is the meaning and purpose of the American corporation? Is it just a bundle of financial assets to be moved around to their highest and best use? Or is a corporation a network of mutual obligations, mutual responsibilities, a compact to produce wealth in the future? Can we have it both ways? The Eastern story suggests no.
Back in '85, I really thought we were going to make it. I mean, we were doing great. We saved millions and millions of dollars, and we had everybody humming. It was like a fine clock. And now the morale out there is pitiful. People hate to come to work here. They're waiting for the other shoe to drop. I would just personally like to see it over with one way or the other, so I can know what to do with my life. I'll go get another job, or I'll do what I have to do. But I hate to go like this way. But I'm not gonna let it wear me down either. I'll be here when they lock the doors.
I don't know how many or any of you have ever been through a labor dispute or a strike, but I got to tell you, I've been through at least 2 or 3 of them. They're always stressful. They're very unpleasant, people say and do things that they're sorry for later on. But you know, when people are fighting for their jobs, they're fighting for wages and benefits. They're worried about their families. They're trying to pay a mortgage. They're worried about their car payments. They get crazy. And I went through 2 of those at Aircraft Braking Systems, and was sent down onto the shop floor for about maybe 3 months to work in a sweltering environment. It was just a miserable time. And I learned to be able to see things from management's point of view and from labor's point of view. And they both had good points. And it was just, the biggest tragedy was that we could never find a way of coming to an agreement until they finally had to cross that threshold to go on strike. Well, what eventually happened, January 19th, 1991, Eastern folded its wings, or Eastern Airlines ceased to be. The location was Miami, Florida. And so as you can see here, the Miami Herald, if you're wondering the war day 3, they're talking about the Gulf War. Recall that in 1990, Saddam Hussein of Iraq invaded Kuwait, and President George H.W. Bush, Bush 1, was in office at the time. And you'll recall that his response was a troop buildup in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Gulf states for what was called Operation Desert Shield, and then the actual launching of offensive operations to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait was Operation Desert Storm. This is the one that made General Schwarzkopf, Norman Schwarzkopf, a hero. It brought Colin Powell to larger prominence. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. So that's what is referred to by the war day 3. And it was just, I mean, the story of Eastern is just tragic. What happens to the people, what happened to the employees, what Frank Borman was trying to do, the emphasis on customer service. But it was a new world. An Eastern, an old world airline that was operating according to old rules, and a union that was operating according to old rules, just was not prepared. And when Frank Borman said that people don't like change, especially when they change is perceived to be threatening. Well, of course people don't like change. And of course they don't like it when it's threatening change. But the change was the deregulation of the airlines. The change was the busting of the air traffic controllers, which meant that unions clearly did not have the strength that they used to. And the change was the fact that in the new environment of deregulation, greater competition, low fares, we had to have faster turnarounds, more nimble responses, be more flexible, and change in the air every day. That was the new normal. And until people got through the new normal, it was just very turbulent. So the situation that we have today at airports, this is all the result of what happened from the airline deregulation, the big fight with the air traffic controllers, and the subsequent fight with Eastern Airlines. Eastern lost that fight, or the employees lost that fight. The customers lost that fight. And these people here, as pictured in this advertisement, were some of the good people. They ended up going out. So Eastern Airlines, that flagship airlines, the Wings of Man, the one that had the slogan, the Wings of Man, we had to earn our wings every day. It was grounded permanently. And it literally became a thing of history. But if, as that Forbes magazine article from 2019 suggests, there may be a rebirth of Eastern Airlines, it will not have nearly the number of routes that it had before. In fact, some of the routes that it will be flying to will be pretty much out of the way for people. Not the kind of routes where you would think they would make a lot of money from them, but that's how things start off, and maybe they'll add more routes. I mean, I think even about a year or so, about 2 or 3 years ago, Southwest Airlines just finally started flying into Grand Rapids, which was a pretty innovative move for them. So we shall see. And we also have to keep in mind, of course, that whatever Eastern Airlines does, the new Eastern Airlines is going to all be part of whatever happens in response to this coronavirus pandemic. So I'd like to hear your questions or get your comments.
I think the coronavirus is going to be a big challenge for not only Eastern, but the other airlines with reduced people flying and people afraid to fly.
I think you're right.
There are other things to think about too. We're in a terrible situation this year, but climate change is a real serious issue. And the airline issues of lots and lots of flights in the air contribute to climate change. So I'm not sure that we need to be thinking of traveling by air.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, listen, one of the things that people have been talking about, I mean, take how we're communicating right now. There are people who are saying, like, if you can have a business meeting virtually, and somebody can sit and either be at home or be in their office and not have to take the time and the expense of going from here to Seattle for a conference, why not just do it this way? That's one way of cutting down. This is how the world is changing before our very eyes right now as a result of this pandemic. And that will be one of the, I suppose there are other good things that'll come out of the pandemic, but that may be one of the good things that comes out of this pandemic. Who remembers the controversy at Eastern? Yeah, that was a pretty big deal.
I didn't.
And then from Eastern, was it next TWA? Braniff?
I think, yeah, Braniff went by the wayside. People Express went by the wayside. US Air, I think US Air was hurt by, they had a problem when one of their planes crashed in the Everglades, I think. And that was because of something having to do with poor ground maintenance. TWA definitely, I don't know if TWA went out of business before Eastern did.
I don't think so, because I can remember a flight I took with TWA back from our job in Europe. Okay. And it was for that. What was the other? Pan Am.
Oh, yes, Pan American. Yeah, I mean, TWA and Pan Am, they went all the way back to the 1930s. Those airlines have been around for a long time. So they were considered flagship carriers.
Right. There was a rule, though, that was obviously not deregulated. Anybody employed by the U.S. government, including military, civilians, and so forth, had to fly American carriers. We could not take Lufthansa or Alitalia. No matter where we lived in the world, we had to take a U.S. carrier.
And that was because of what?
Greed for the government. I don't know.
Well,
I don't know.
It's guaranteed business for the airlines, of course.
Yeah.
Kind of as a follow-up to Donna's comments, we really don't have a viable public transport system that could give us an alternative to flying between cities, where other countries have invested in rapid train service and that kind of thing.
Right.
We're kind of stuck.
Right. I got to tell you, I was at a global health conference last December in Hong Kong, and I've always been interested in things like trains and, well, transportation systems. And ever since I moved to Michigan, I've become preoccupied and obsessed about roads, especially roads that are smooth and repaired. But in Hong Kong, I specifically looked for how their transportation system was integrated. And I'm telling you, it is possible to go from the airport in Hong Kong and get on a train that'll take you out to the area where you catch a cab or a bus or another tram. You can go from Hong Kong to I think it was Langtao Island on a ferry, or take a tram like one of those sky trams from Langtao back to Hong Kong to a subway train back into the center city. That'll take you within blocks of your hotel. And it's just a short walk. And I looked at how the airport, roads, taxi, train, subway, ferry systems, they all seem to be integrated. I mean, I sat there one day looking at that because we were taking the SkyTram back from Langtao. And so I had literally a sky view of how this was all laid out. And we were so high up, you could see airplanes down below us landing and taking off from the airport. So when I looked across and saw how the airport was situated next to the train station and the bus station, and how those were situated next to the subway station, how the rails ran back toward the main island, and then the ferries as well, I thought to myself, the level of planning and detailed planning to lay all that out, and the dedication of resources to build all that, to integrate it, was just amazing. It was so amazing. And I just felt so bad that, you know, we don't have a national train system, passenger rail. And they're talking about experimenting with things like called maglevs, you know, magnetic levitation. And, you know, I think that in Japan for a number of years now, they had this very famous thing called the bullet train. You know, we're still dealing with Amtrak and diesel locomotives. So we have so much catching up to do with the rest of the world when it comes to having a state-of-the-art 21st century national transportation system, which could do a whole lot, I think. I'm pretty sure it could do a whole lot to addressing Donna's point about climate change. That is, of course, if you believe in climate change.
We do happen to have a transportation lady in charge. I wonder what she's been doing. I don't know. I never hear what Mrs. Cho is doing.
I haven't heard anything either, which may be indicative of something else.
Fred, this is Kim. I don't know if you can see the chat with your screen sharing, but there's a question from Richard Byrne asking, why did Delta grow so well? Delta employees, except for pilots, were non-union and both hubbed in Atlanta. Can you comment on that?
I don't know why, but Delta became one of the big competitors that benefited from airline deregulation, and from the other airlines that I looked at, Delta was one of those that was able to absorb some of those. You remember I mentioned during the presentation that the airlines that already existed, what they did was they scrambled to make sure that they could hold on to their lucrative markets and or get access to other lucrative markets. Delta did that. Delta expanded its range, and they simply just organized themselves to being able to take advantage of the new deregulated environment. But beyond that, I don't exactly know what Delta did. Being based in Atlanta, I think, might have given them a regional advantage because they had access to the Caribbean, which means vacationers, and also South America and Central America. But beyond that, I wouldn't want to venture to say.
Thanks.
Fred, having lived in Chicago for a long time and Cincinnati for a long time, I realized how difficult it was to take public transportation to the airport. It just seemed to be a political nightmare of lobbying, and whether it was the taxi industry or whatever it was that was preventing. Chicago's famous for its railroads. Chicago has fabulous railroads into the city from the suburbs, but until, I don't know, a very late date, you could not take fast public transportation to the airport from downtown Chicago. Just ridiculous. And Cincinnati has its airport fairly far outside the city. So again, it was difficult to get there, except through taxi. And these things have to be resolved. When I lived in Cincinnati, Delta had such a clamp on the fares going out of Cincinnati. I was commuting to Newark very frequently. But I would have to go to Columbus or Dayton to get a good fare. Travel from Cincinnati to either Dayton or Columbus, And the fare difference was enough that it was almost, it was worth the extra driving to go to a different airport. And those kinds of things just don't make any sense. They're so inefficient because fare wars are so, you can't avoid the fact that there's going to be competition for fares.
Right.
But where's the management that's going to work to make this more efficient? You shouldn't have to travel to Dayton to get a good fare from Cincinnati to Newark.
You're right. And I have myself traveled from Akron down to Columbus to catch, to get a flight with a better fare. I travel from Holland to Detroit to get a better fare. So you travel 3 hours across the state to get a better fare. And I got to tell you, every mile of the 3-hour trip from Holland to Detroit, I'm saying, what's the matter with you? Are you really driving 3 hours to catch a plane to fly 6 hours? Well, yeah, I am. Because, we're all trying to save some money. And it just doesn't make sense. But you said that, where's the management in this deregulated environment? I think if the proper phrase is unintended consequences, as far as I have been able to observe it, deregulation, it further siloed each airline to look out for its own best interest, right? So they're not all cooperating, they're all competing with each other. And so it's in their interest to drive the other guy out of business. So if I can drive this lady out of business, then that's just better for me. So the price wars, as far as they're concerned, are better. If you've ever flown Spirit Airlines, you can get a flight on Spirit Airlines for a ridiculously cheap price. Now, what they'll do, let's say you get your flight for $49. That's great. Then they charge you $50 for breathing air. All right? $75 for the cup of water. And then they hit you with all these other kind of costs to make it for what they wouldn't do in the tickets. But I hear what you're saying, Linda, because I used to look at what the fares between the transportation system at Cleveland Hopkins Airport and the one down in Columbus, night and day. Night and day, the way they're structured, the way they're arranged. And if you've ever flown into Dallas-Fort Worth or Hartsfield in Atlanta, my goodness, trying to get from the airport to a rental car system, it's ridiculous. It takes like 40 minutes just the drive from the airport on the shuttle from the main terminal to the rental car place. Now, when I catch a flight from Midway in Chicago on Southwest, because I really like flying Southwest Airlines. But to get to Midway, I don't go to Chicago anymore because I can't stand the drive on 294 and 94 to get to the airport.
Yep.
So for me, I love airplanes. I love flying. But I got to the point now where I hate it because I can't stand the process of getting to the airplane. I'm sorry. I'm yelling at you all. So my frustration's coming through. but I do love airplanes. I always have. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. But maybe I'm going the wrong way. But when I fly to Chicago Midway, I go down Cicero Avenue and I go through those million lights. I'm thinking to myself, I could have built an aircraft carrier by the time I get to the airport.
What effect has the scanning of people before they get on airplanes gotten done to the industry?
Well, from my observation, I just tell you as a consumer, as somebody who's a consumer of air travel, what it's done is they've gotten better at it, and they are so innovative in the ways that they can invent to separate the customer from their money. After 9/11, it's like, everybody's got to go through screening. Now they have to say like, hey, if you want to go through expedited screening, an extra $50, you can go through in this line. The rest of it, but the proletariat and the peasants, you're in that line, which of course is longer and slower and more invasive for what they're going to be checking, right? And you pay the $50, they go through, look at you, smile, wave you onto the airplane. I'm like, how do you know that guy doesn't have a bomb? But yet they're taking my mouthwash. Seriously? So it's injected elements of more steps, more confusion, and sometimes it literally comes down to the people you're working with, about how fast they are. After 9/11, I'll tell you all the story. After 9/11, The first flight I took out of Grand Rapids, so like, I don't know, maybe a month later, I was taking a flight to Grand Rapids. And they had put in all the security stuff, you know, and the screenings and so forth. So I get to the TSA lady. She says, well, you got to take off your shoes. I said, okay, take off my shoes. She said, you have to, she said, take off your coat. I took off my coat. She said, you have to, can you undo your belt buckle? I went, really? She said, yeah. So I undid my belt buckle. Then she said, well, can you, she said something, you have to do this, do that. Well, by the time I got through taking off all my stuff, my watch, you know, my wallet, my cell phone, she had all that stuff. She said, okay, you can go through. I said, are you sure that's all you want? I said, because, you know, I said, usually I don't get this undressed unless I'm going to marry somebody. But it was, I mean, it was so crazy. So now they're not making you do that. But depending, another part, to get to what Linda was talking about, another part of the very fragmented system we have is that you can go to some airports, some security screening checkpoints, you gotta take your shoes off. Others, they don't make you do it. I can never tell what the criteria is for one as opposed to the other. Unless there's a different security alert for, let's say, Chicago Midway as opposed to DTW in Detroit.
Just wait until you're old enough and you don't have to take your shoes off anymore, Fred.
Okay, I'll look forward to that. I look forward to that day.
Well, I was interested in the point that someone made that all the airlines can buy the same planes. So it gets down to the difference between airlines is what services they give you. Well, now to get a low fare, as you said, you're not only not going to get a lobster meal, but you'll be lucky to even get a few crackers. So it becomes a game of outsmarting the airlines, like how few pieces of baggage can you get your stuff into, and how can you bring your own snacks so you don't even need anything but a cup of water, and carrying through all these tricks to try to get, you know, a reasonable rate. Competition is the key to our idea of how businesses thrive and how economy finally comes out of it. But yet it's going to cost many airlines. It's going to be a continual merry-go-round of different airlines taking over and other airlines losing their grip. Warren Buffett just made big news by selling a huge stake in the 4 biggest airlines in the last couple of months. And all the gurus were saying, oh, Warren Buffett missed the boat. He made such a big mistake because those airlines went up again after Buffett did that. Well, he's not looking at the short term. He's wondering whether any airlines are really going to be able to be sure to be a good investment right now with what we have to expect that the country's going to go through, you know. And I can understand that. I think it's hard for any one airline to establish that moat or that margin of excellence that makes them, gives them security, you know, in business.
And you know that what, you know, with work, I don't know, one of you all mentioned, somebody mentioned from Tom, he said, I totally forgot about this subject. The only sour note was when they mentioned in the film Donald Trump. I'm looking forward to the presentation next week. Look, remember Robert Reich was in that last video I showed. Robert Reich was the Treasury Secretary, I think, the Treasury Secretary for Bill Clinton. And when he asked the question, what's the meaning and purpose of the U.S. corporation? And remember Frank Borman and his I told you so comments, he said, people don't like change, and they especially don't like change that's threatening. Well, the environment that we're in right now, it is clearly a time of change. Not all airlines are going to survive. Some of them are going out of business right now because of the tremendous drop in air traffic and air travel. So we don't know who's going to be around. You know, when the dust settles and the smoke clears, we don't know who the last man and woman is going to be standing when this pandemic finally gets behind us. And I pray God that it's sooner than later. But you take those factors economically, and then add everything you're talking about relative to service, it's anybody's guess right now. It's anybody's guess. So I have another comment. Why did Delta grow so well? Someone mentioned Bob K. too. I experienced several of the self-propelled pushbacks. thought it was a very risky procedure. Remember, the planes are not equipped with rear view mirrors. Very good point, very good point. Let me see. How has the pre-flight passenger screening affected the airlines? I think I addressed that one, Suzanne.
That was me.
Yeah.
What was the deal with the sale to Donald Trump of the airline? Was that the start of his airline, or what?
Yeah,
That?
I think that when Frank Lorenzo sold off the Eastern, I think it was called the Eastern Shuttle, he sold that to Trump. And for a minute there, I don't know if that was the thing that became Trump Airlines. But I know Trump was dabbling in the airline business for a moment there. And you know, the reason why this was again a story of interest to me was because I was working for Goodyear Aerospace, which was a division of Goodyear Tire and Rubber. Goodyear Tire and Rubber was the world's largest tire manufacturer in the mid-late 1980s. We got raided, and Goodyear, in an attempt to buy back its stock, sold off some of its assets. We were an asset. So, man, I have lived through at least 2 or 3 of these evolutions where you get bought, and then the company sells off the assets, and then when you get sold off, when the asset gets sold off, when you get in the hands of a holding company, I'm not saying this happens all the time, but in my experience, anytime you get in the hands of a holding company, it's just bad. That's the high point. It goes down from there. You were an asset to have your bones picked clean, because these men and women at the holding companies, they're not in the business of really running the organization. They're trying to financially maximize what they can do with the asset they have. And if selling it is going to be the financial maximization that's best for them, that's what they do.
Fred, don't you think that when people retire, that seniors do take into account reasonable access to air travel as one thing they want in wherever they're going to retire or buy a home or move into a retirement village? And, you know, at one time, Holland was sort of touch and go, because it would be, when my mother retired to Holland, it was so difficult for her to get to the airport. She'd have to ask someone for a ride. It'd be on 44th Street all the way across Grand Rapids, because it didn't exist yet. And that has improved so much for retirees in Holland now in the last 10 or 15 years, that we can feel like, you know, we can fly out of Grand Rapids to just about anywhere.
And somebody says in the chat, you can, well, can you comment on Allegiant? I don't know enough about Allegiant, but you're right about this. About 40. When I first moved up here, to fly out of Grand Rapids, I guess I didn't know any other route, but you get to 44th Street, and it was almost like driving down, going down Cicero, getting to Chicago Midway. I kept thinking to myself, "Are you kidding me?"
Yeah.
You know. Then they built M6, and I went, "Good, M6." Then of course M6 started crumbling. They had to repair it. Yeah. So you know, I guess I'm stuck with being on what I call I-94, which I refer to as the world's largest east-west parking lot.
Yeah. Maybe the airlines don't take seriously enough the senior population and how important they're going to be, the travel habits of seniors. Think how it's changed family life to realize that when we retire, it's all right if our kids are, one is in Ohio and one is in New Jersey. There's more places to fly to, and it's not that hard to go and join our children for holidays or visit the grandkids, because flying has changed a lot in the last 20 years.
You know what I think is going to happen after this pandemic, or as a result of this pandemic? I don't know how long it's going to last, but I bet you everybody's going to be getting a whole lot of love on their flights these days. Because now, you know, can somebody answer this question for me? How do we let them bamboozle us into paying for our luggage? I remember a time when you didn't have to pay for your luggage. I can't remember when it happened, but I keep thinking to myself, why am I going to fly someplace and not take my underwear with me? My stuff. They know you got to bring it. So this is just, again, it's another very, I don't even know if it's innovative. It's just another greedy attempt to extract money from you. And they talked about, well, you know, it costs extra because of the weight of the suitcases. Man, are you serious? My suitcase is going to cost you that much money? Going to make me pay $50 for carrying my own stuff? And then I've seen those people at TSA too. They take in my mouthwash. They take in my deodorant. They take in my lotion. I mean, Okay, never mind. This turned into a rant.
Now you have to have a whole separate set of knowledge to know how to fly without getting into all those things, the size.
I'm telling you, it's, you know, you had to get the little freezer bags that you had to shrink wrap and put into your suitcase. I go to the drugstore and buy little bottles of mouthwash and whatnot. So once you learn how to do it, you can zip right through. But it took some doing.
A lot of work.
What other comments? Let me see. I hope air travel is considered more in the future, less pollution, more relaxing. Had great experience with cross-country train travel. I went to see my cousins when I was still living in Ohio. I decided to go to New York to see my cousins. It took me 14 hours by train. I'm sorry, I was still living in the DC area. 14 hours from Maryland to New York. You can walk to New York faster than that from the DC area. They stopped in every little town, every little post office. I said, what is this, the Wild West? You know, tumbleweeds, you know, ranches. Come on, man. I mean, they stopped in every town to pick people up. And I thought, this is why the rail system is failing.
Fred,
I am a fan of trains. I studied railroads for my dissertation, so I think trains are the way to go. You know, trains are first off, I don't think that they will pollute as much. They're efficient. We need better rail warning systems and crossings and so forth. I'm convinced that we can, as a nation, we can do this, but we finally put our minds to it. But we just got to summon the will.
Fred, I remember when the airlines were just for rich people, people dressed up in their suits, and and a flight to the West Coast was 9 hours, and if you left at night, you had a sleeper. What do they call it? And so now we have a lot of cheaper fares and people are flying more. But I'm afraid with Zoom that a lot of the business people won't be flying anymore, and that's going to have a big effect on the airlines. And their business class and everything else that's coming on. So we're going to see a whole lot of changes coming, not only in the industry but in all of our lives.
Yeah, you're right, Mike. And I think that if in fact the number of airlines get reduced in number, and there are fewer people who are flying, that means that the airlines will probably have to raise their prices up for those who are flying, and that's going to cut out a whole lot of people who would otherwise be on an airplane. So again, we don't know how this is going to shake out. But just like I would much rather be talking to you all in person instead of doing it this way. Zoom has its purposes, and we're doing it right now because this is just how we have to do it. But given a choice of flying to see my sister and my sisters and my nephews in Maryland, or talking to them via Zoom is okay if it's January in Michigan. I don't want to get out on the road. But if it's the summertime, I'd much rather be there with them. Well, maybe not my sister, but my nephews. But no, my sister and I get along great. I just like to poke her. So we don't know what it's going to do. I think that you're right, though. There is going to be a definite economic restructuring, and not voluntarily by the airlines either. It's just amazing to watch how the world is literally being reshaped in front of our eyes on a daily basis.
Fred, is there any cutting edge as far as what fuel airlines might use in the future? I had a friend whose husband was a buyer of fuel for airlines, always guessing what the price would be months out, and they would stock up and so forth. But will airlines always be dependent on gasoline engines?
As far as I can tell, yes, they will. I know that Pratt & Whitney and other aircraft engine manufacturers have been for decades now working on producing engines that are more fuel efficient, quieter, because they're worried about noise pollution, as well as air pollution and fuel efficiency. In other words, trying to get more miles out of every gallon of jet fuel or jet aviation gasoline. I've been following every now and then, looking up on the modifications to the B-52. The B-52 that aircraft was first flown, I mean, the B-52, our bomber fleet of B-52s, those airplanes are older than most of the pilots who are flying them. They've been around that long. And so the B-52s have had their service life extended because they've done some significant upgrades in the engines, making them quieter, more powerful, and more fuel efficient. But whether or not they'll ever be able to get away from jet fuel, I don't know how that's going to happen.
All right, everybody, it's 11:15. I don't want to keep Fred too long because I know we could talk to him all day.
Well, can I just tell you all, like I told you last time, I miss you all tremendously. I cannot wait to be in the same room with you again.
Thank you. Same. Okay, I'm going to stop recording and I'll stay on for a minute if anybody has anything else, but otherwise, Fred, thank you. It was another awesome presentation.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.